Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Darshan Talks. My name is Darshan Kulkarni. I'm here with Sarah Karlin, and Sarah's actually, I've met Sarah probably close to a decade ago, but we bumped into each other at a conference, and it was kind of fun, and we've sort of semi-stayed in touch, for lack of a better term. But I was lucky enough to ask her if she'd be interested in coming on as a guest, and she agreed. So before we get started, Sarah, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. So I'm Sarah Karlin-Smith. I've been probably covering healthcare with focus on pharmaceuticals for a little over a decade now, maybe closer to 12 years. And for a mix of sort of trade publications, like where I write for now, the Pink Sheet, I started out with a publication called FDA News, and then I've also written a bit for Politico. So I've covered kind of everything from, clinical trials to how medicines get developed to how they're priced in the U.S. and, who pays for them and, everything kind of in between that process and, what happens with pharmaceuticals at the Supreme Court and at state governments and at the federal government. Definitely with a, heaviest focus on kind of federal government regulations and FDA with a little side of drug pricing.
With the side of drug pricing. Never quite had it described like that, but sure. So let me ask you this, Sarah. How do you, are you a journalist by by schooling? Okay.
Correct. That's my sort of, right. My degree, I guess, is in journalism. And then all of my sort of health policy education about pharmaceutical space, regulatory space has sort of just been on the job training.
So why pharmaceuticals? Why did that sort of jump onto you? Or did you just fall into it?
So Aaliyah, I think like a little bit of both. Actually when I first saw the job opening for FDA News, at the time I was like really interested in like food policy and, how food is regulated, or perhaps in the case of food, lack thereof in this country, how, agriculture and so forth. It turns out that FDA News doesn't really cover a lot of food stuff. At the time, I think they still had one publication that did touch on food a little bit. I'm not sure if they even still do. But I ended up getting a job there, covering pharmaceutical space. And I just think that a lot of the reasons I was attracted to food policy world you can find in sort of the medicine world in terms of, it's something that impacts everybody, health, it just like is interesting. The drug space, I think, there's just always something going on, right? There's always, for better or worse, there's a lot of diseases, there's a lot we know and places where we have like made great progress in cures, but there's a lot we don't know about biology. It's pretty humbling. So there's, no one's going to be putting this area of, news out of business anytime soon. And you add to that just like the biological kind of medical challenges to the, particularly in the US, the sort of payer health policy system challenges. We have a pretty complicated system in the US. There's always sort of like loopholes or holes or things people are trying to figure out how to tweak. I guess right when I really started covering the area, it was right as like Obamacare was sort of starting to be implemented, I guess. So that's obviously I don't know that people necessarily think about it as being a very drug specific bill, but there certainly were ramifications for pharma. And I think just like over the years, that's again created sort of another source of sort of news and flow. So it's just intellectually interesting. So I've kept doing it.
And what kind of role do you play now? Do you sort of report, or are you more editing, or are you more? I don't know the hierarchy in the news world, so talk to me a little bit about that.
Yeah, no, I would describe myself as a reporter. And my days sort of figuring out, okay, what's going on, looking into things, covering meetings, going to meetings, figuring out what's worth writing about, reading documents, press conferences, congressional hearings, all that kind of stuff.
So it's funny you talk about this idea of sort of press conferences and meetings and stuff like that, which seems like the obvious or where you get a lot of the information. I find it interesting because when I think of journalists, I think of reporters. I'm thinking of like the Watergate kind of stuff, the investigative journalism kind of thing. Is that a thing in pharma? Do you find yourself ever digging in that deep? Or is it there's just an overflow of information anyways, and you're still trying to catch up on what's happening day to day? Does that question make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a little bit of both. I would say like there are definitely like people and outlets that because of the sort of like metabolism of like the news outlet or their reporting, they're able to maybe spend like months, or sometimes even I've heard of people that can kind of spend years really digging through things and doing stories. I mean, I usually have to write at least one thing a week, usually more. So like there's a level of investigation you can do, or you have multiple stories going on at the same time, and maybe while you're waiting, I don't know, to get documents back from a FOIA, or, to connect with X or Y source on something, like, so you might have a piece that you are sort of trying to do more of an investigative piece, and then you're kind of working on like the day-to-day churn of news. But I feel like at the Pink Sheet, I would describe a lot of our work as sort of very analytical. So we're trying to digest what is happening in real time, but really trying to find like that meaning for our, core audience of people working in this sector, right? I'm not writing for the average person on the street who is probably reading, more of their like mainstream news publication. If you're reading us, you have a certain level of like sophistication in the space. So, our focus in stories is going to speak to that and give you a sense of why this really matters if you're in the business, or if you're a lawyer counseling, companies here. So, like sometimes I think like not in the investigative sense you might be thinking of if you're thinking of Watergate, but we're going to sometimes pull out random things like a footnote in a document that may have more significance than somebody thinks it has, or may have the time to spend reading, and then kind of dive into that. Or, I have one of my colleagues, Bridget, does a ton of stuff with just like trends, in the drug approval development space. So she's, constantly tracking like not just like how many approvals, but like really reading all the documents that come out every year and kind of looking for trends. And I think last week she put out a report more on complete response letters when the drugs are rejected. So, we're doing what I would call like sort of deeper dives and analysis that kind of end up with unique pieces, but maybe without that same like overt like, you could turn this into a movie story that is Watergate, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And I think that's kind of the interesting part to me, right? Because you guys are doing it's a smarter level of analysis than for the average person. And I struggle with the idea of, I'm already drowning in information. What is the point of buying a subscription? Because these subscriptions can be super expensive. And it's weird telling that to the journalists working for these subscriptions, but I think I kind of figure I'll get the answer that I'm missing. Like I found myself subscribing, for example, and to Law 360, because why not? And Law 360 is great. They provide some great information, but I find myself going, would I not have seen this information in a different spot over time? Is the timeliness important? Talk to me about who is that ideal audience that for the Pink Sheet makes sense, where you're going, you know what? Yes, you could wait for this, but if you need it now, we're the place to go. So who's that audience?
There's sort of like this strange wall, I think, in journalism, right? Between the people who like sell our publications and do some of this, and like someone like me. So like we have this general sense of like, pretty much like most of the major drug companies read us, and the, high sort of level people that work for them and their regulatory people and so forth, or again, law firms that serve those clients, and certainly FDA and a lot of the agencies read us and so forth. Sometimes like the actual like trickle down of like a profile of who's reading us and why doesn't always reach us in some extent, because like you want your journalists in this type of publication, right, writing for your audience without like being maybe too influenced by them, if that makes sense. Like, so I think there's some strange like levels of transparency or lack thereof that result. If that, I realize I'm saying if that makes sense all the time. I'm trying to avoid that. But so I mean, like one thing I would think of is like if I compare like some of the work I did at Politico versus the Pink Sheet, like at Politico, one of the things particularly on our like pro side is we were really into speed a lot of the time, because a lot of the people reading us were lobbyists, and so these are that when a bill is in development, say like the FDA user fee going through Congress, and like these are people that need like those minute by minute updates of, oh, okay, like this amendment is in play, oh, it's not in play, or these people say they're going to support it or they want to tweak, right? And some of that stuff I think at the Pink Sheet, like our understanding of our readers is like they need that but slightly differently, because maybe not like that same level of play by play, because there may be people a little bit higher up or in a different part of the like regulatory food chain, so they do want to know like what is going to be in the bill or what could be in the bill or why it matters. But like for them it would almost be like overkill, right, to get all that play by play that like, okay, today's Wednesday, on Friday like none of that matters anymore, right? And there are people in the middle whose job it is to like maybe even make that change happen, right? Like why does this no longer happen by Friday? So I think like even within like these like world of specialty publications and things people pay money for, there's like different ways of like kind of thinking about like what value you can provide or service you can provide. So I feel like the Pink Sheet, like we are aiming for like a certain type of timeliness, but like analysis side of it to really like get you like figuring out like, okay, why does this matter? One of the things I think that's like our bread and butter is we do a lot of, at least from like the regulatory folks at the Pink Sheet, is like advisory committee coverage for FDA. And when I'm covering those meetings, one of the things I'm always thinking about is like, okay, not just what is the outcome like for this drug and this company and this product, but like what are the lessons from the process this drug went through at FDA or is going through now or with this advisory committee that will apply to other drugs, whether it's in that class, whether it's, more broadly, like who from FDA speaks at that meeting and says something that's like, and sometimes they do that, right? They're like, this is one of the few sometimes like public forums that some of these drug reviewers have, and they're sending messages and it's not just to that sponsor. So like we're looking for those sorts of things that like, okay, somebody who's working in that field has to like say like, okay, like, oh, like this is a mistake that this company made, like we're not going to make it with this drug. And sometimes I've written some of these stories for so long, you're like, you see like another company go through the same thing and I'm like, wait a second, like I'm just like a journalist covering some of these issues, and I've seen now like 3 companies make this mistake and I could have told you that, like, so like you guys gotta like pay attention a little bit more. But I think like that's sort of where our like metabolism, which I think that's like that's a very news word. I'm not sure if other people appreciate that outside of the news space lies, is sort of like figuring out how to take what's going on right now that is newsworthy, and then again give it to sort of our clientele in a way that's like, okay, you guys are in this business, what are the lessons for you, or what do you need to have to watch now that this has happened going forward?
I find that fascinating because I hadn't thought of the fact that in this space, I almost thought that I am, whether we're talking Law 360, we're talking about a Pink Sheet, we're talking about blogs, I always thought they're all the same information, just whoever's covering whatever. And what you just pointed out to me was something I missed before, which was they're different audiences. Some are looking for second by second coverage. Some are looking for what's the takeaway lesson. Each of which obviously has a dramatic effect. Companies are obviously doing something similar with their regulatory intelligence departments. Do you find them having the same nuance? I don't know if you connect or talk to those departments, but do you find that they have that nuance, or do you find that they are more in the overall data collection business, if that makes sense?
I'm not sure I have a great answer for that. I know, like, the sort of things I'm thinking of, which may not be what you're referring to here, is like sometimes I get emails from like analysts. Some of them are financial analysts connected more to like investment banks, but some of them are more like DC policy analysts that are sort of doing the same thing, but a little less like financial focused. The things that I read in that space tend to be like almost a little bit more high level. So like a summation of some of the stuff we're doing, but like shorter, more snippy in a way, I guess. But I think like some of what we're doing for the regulatory folks at some of these firms is like flagging for them sometimes like what they then need to look at even more deeply. Right? So if we look at a guidance and kind of cover it or point out what has changed from the draft to the final or something like that, like somebody else probably then has to go in and like go through it more like line by line in a different way so they can submit comments and stuff like that. So like I tend to find like for certain types of regulatory documents, we often cover them before people at the companies have had a chance to really look through them, right? Because they'll be like, we can't comment on this today. Today it's too soon. So we're kind of giving them just like them another perspective of, okay, what might jump out to somebody else reading this, or who maybe like might use it to think like, okay, who in my firm needs to read this and focus, do we need to comment on this or not? So I think that's probably one of the ways we complement like regulatory folks in-house.
So you raised an important point, which is commenting. It's one of those things that every law firm wants their people to do. Everyone wants their name in these important publications. How do they get in front of you? What is the best way to go? Sarah, I'm here. I want to comment on everything you let me comment on. How do you get in front of the right journalists?
It's hard because I don't know. I think the way a lot of journalists get pitched is we get pitched a lot of like inappropriate people, right? Or you get a lot of like, it's hard to weed out the people that really make sense for you to talk to from the people that like won't at all make sense to you for talk to. I tend to find like it's helpful for me like what I would call like a cold call pitch of like maybe like the PR for a person at the law firm, just like flagging that somebody exists and can comment, to be like less likely to result in me using them than like say you gave a presentation on an interesting topic at like Fidley or something like that, or DIA, one of these like drug kind of focused regulatory meetings, and I was like, oh, he's interesting. He was talking about like X topic. That would probably give me a sense of like, maybe you're worth going back to. I guess like the one time I think those sort of cold call pitches sometimes work more effectively is when you have people that like left from like a government regulatory agency and they go to a firm, because it's often really hard to get people while they're in the government to talk to you on the record. So anytime like you can get people when they've left who can like really provide that like they're almost inside but they have the more freedom to talk, I think those people are often helpful. So like just sometimes it's like flagging that they switch jobs and all that kind of stuff. That's one of the ways. I mean, I think more and more these days, like I find people on Twitter, like a lot of academic legal experts who are willing to use Twitter and sort of promote their work that way. You can just like kind of get a sense of what they're doing and then get a feel for them and kind of like know or trust like their reliability, and that helps But it's hard because, again, like, you want to make sure you're people with the right expertise, credibility, all these things for the story you're working on, and figuring out how to do that can be challenging. I mean, a lot of times, like, what I'll do when, like, I have a story and I'm like, I want this kind of expertise, I'll go to somebody who, like, I feel like, and I'm not quite sure who to go to. I'll say, like, okay, like, I think your field's kind of like adjacent to this. You might not be the right person, but who do you know? Who should I talk to? And that often gets me places. I have to say, one of the things that's also hard in the pharmaceutical space with law firms is sometimes you guys have so many clients, right? And so you get into these situations where you have, like, really smart people in firms, but, like, they have to do these, like, checks of, like, oh, is my client involved in this? Yeah. And can we be helpful? So oftentimes, like, sometimes you can't talk to as many people at firms as might be useful. So you end up relying more on academics. But I think that's, like, a challenge too, especially when we're on, like, tight deadlines of things like that. So also, again, people that are people you can trust who will get back to you in a timely manner. And even if sometimes, like, that's just saying, like, really fast, like, I can't help you today, try X, or, like, you know, or, like, this is not my expertise, try X, or just, I can't help you, just so we sort of know, like, okay, how to move on. Because, again, like, there are days when you're on a daily deadline, there are days when you have a day or 2 or 3, but you have to kind of have some predictability or confidence in who's getting back to you.
Yeah. Oh, which is, you raised, like, 3 things that really spoke to me. The first was, right now after COVID, everyone's sort of reimagining the importance of speaking at these conferences because they've all gone virtual. And people are saying, well, why am I gonna bother paying for XYZ, traveling to the other side of the country to talk? What you just pointed out is that's where people will notice you. And that's where people will sort of know the value you can bring. And someone like a news reporter might say, oh, I've seen him or her add value to the conversation. So it speaks to the value of these conferences, which is amazing. The second thing that sort of jumped out to me was something we actually spoke about before we jumped on, which was the value of Twitter. And the idea of everyone's been talking about, is Twitter dying? And what you just pointed out is, it may be, who knows what the future holds. But at this moment, you're still looking at it as a source of resources, which is kind of interesting as well. Are you finding yourself using things like Mastodon or not so much?
So I did set up a post account. I haven't played around with Mastodon yet. I think it's hard because, like, on the one hand, I want to try a little bit, and on the other hand, again, it's like these things can start consuming a lot of your time, right? And time is of the essence here when you're on pretty fast deadlines and paying attention to meetings. So I think it's hard for me to want to commit to any of these platforms at any level of, like, depth until I know, like, a certain critical mass of people are shifting there and are going to use it, right? Because I'm using Twitter. I mean, I think most people would think, like, journalists are using Twitter to be, like, self-promotional, which we are to an extent. But the main value, I mean, for me, is really that it's just a really fast way to, like, organize and keep track of the headlines in the space, and then, you know, and the people in the space, and kind of see what's going on fast and just kind of quickly digest whether I need to pay attention to it or not. And so, like, it's hard to rebuild that up again, right? Like, if you're following kind of a few thousand people and you've sort of categorized them in a tweet deck into, like, you know, like, pharma people or regulatory people and government officials and all that stuff, and then to sort of rebuild that in another platform is hard. So if Twitter isn't going to die, I'm not sure I have a huge incentive to, like, invest in many other platforms. And different people at my work, I think, like, they have their different social media platforms. I think some people like using LinkedIn and use LinkedIn more. I'm trying to think of what other platforms, right? But and I think some don't use Twitter, and, you know, I probably use Twitter more than some people. And I think there's just like only so much time you have for social media and figuring out how to follow the news. So yeah, I just don't think that I just don't feel like right now, at least at this point, like I have the time to like curate a whole new platform unless I really know that like everybody's coming with me. So you guys can all let me know where I should go. And I think one of the reasons I was drawn to post over Mastodon is it just seems simpler to kind of figure out, or a little more like all user friendly. Like Mastodon, right? You have sort of these like separate networks, I guess, kind of, and you have to figure out how to navigate those. And you know, again, I was just like looking for like, okay, I should probably like have a foot somewhere else just in case I have to jump. But you know, I'm not like super eager to jump if all the knowledge isn't actually leaving Twitter.
Do you find yourself using things like Clubhouse, or were they just too sort of flash in the pan to affect it?
This is where I feel like I'm gonna age myself, but I'm not that old. Again, I feel like I'm a little bit like, I don't know, I just get kind of like, I don't want to keep having to learn new platforms. Yeah. I tend to, in my workflow, even though we're on a podcast, and I regularly am on a couple podcasts, I'm not somebody that listens to a lot of things in the course of my normal workflow, unless like it's something I have to listen to. So like if it's a meeting I'm covering, right, you kind of have to listen to that. But like when I'm like doing work and trying to follow the news, like for me, the most effective way I kind of like learn and retain knowledge is through reading. So like, and something like Clubhouse doesn't appeal to me as much, right? You know, podcasts are something I more would find like listening to in my free time, as opposed to like when I'm trying to multitask at work. So like if I'm trying to like get work related knowledge and it's not like a meeting or an event I'm assigned to cover, I'm probably going to read it. So that, and that's just, again, it's sort of part of like how I learn and how I've decided to do what I do, versus like one of my coworkers, right, like will keep like CNBC and all that other stuff like on all day, every day. And you know, that's helpful for him, and for me that would drive me crazy.
I mean, I have several more questions that I wanted to ask, but we're well past time. Before we go, what is the best way for people to reach you? So
I put my Twitter on there at Sarah Karlin. My DMs are open. The one terrible thing nowadays with Twitter is I get too much, all this crazy spam all of a sudden since Twitter has shifted. But I do try and like check my DMs and weed through that. It tends to be less cluttered than my email, so that's probably the best way.
And I hope you'll consider coming again. This was amazing. So Sarah, thank you again for coming on.
Yeah, thank you for having me.